At the Nocturnist, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
Little old ladies. Everyone in medicine has their soft spots. Miss C, my patient, was definitely a little old lady. It was one of those situations where you would go into the room to do the physical exam and you'd go and you'd untuck the sheet from the corner of the bed and you'd throw it over expecting to find legs, and there would be nothing there. And it's because you had vastly overestimated how much of the bed the patient actually took up. Miss C also fell into another favorite category of mine, adorable Asian grandparent. I know you all feel the same way. She was 90, Mandarin speaking only, and preferred for her daughters to do all the communicating and translating on her behalf. And despite our inability to communicate with words, it felt like there was a genuine warmth between us. And this warmth might have actually been physical because I would actually go into the room every day and sit on the edge of the bed and hold her hand as we would talk about the plan for the day. And sometimes this warmth actually translated into material goods. One day, I had made a comment about how I had seen some mangoes in her room that her daughters had brought her and that I loved mangoes. And the next day, lo and behold, several mangoes just for me, which I did not share with my team. And so this was great. The irony of the situation, though, was that Missy's face would light up every time I would come into the room. But most of what I was actually communicating with her and her family was really dark and negative. And it was basically news that ranged from bad to worse. You see, Missy was something of a medical mystery, and not one of those fun ones on House. It was a situation where we had a previously healthy 90-year-old who was rapidly declining, and we didn't know why. All we really knew was that her calcium levels were super high. And for those of you not in medicine, or for those of you that are and have forgotten, really high calcium levels that require you to be hospitalized, plus being old, plus rapid decline, basically points to one thing: cancer. The problem was we didn't know where it was coming from. Complicating matters was the fact that although Miss C's family was incredibly loving, they were equally anxious. And every decision, every little thing required extensive dialogue and communication. I, on average, probably spent an hour to 2 in that room every day talking to the family, which over the course of 2 weeks adds up to a lot of time. And yes, a lot of that time was spent talking through risks and benefits, pros and cons, logistics. But a lot of that time was also spent just learning about her and learning that she was really active in her church. And like me, loved arts and crafts, including beadworking. And all of these things made me incredibly invested in her care. And I, along with her family, wanted to try to figure out what was going on. And so we would have 45-minute discussions about the CT scan that we needed to get. And then the next day, we wouldn't get it done because the family had actually declined because they were worried about the radiation, something we had actually talked about the day before. And so her care moved forward, albeit slowly. And then one day we finally got a piece of information that shed some light, quite literally. We got a scan that lights up whenever something is consuming energy. And in this case, the thing that we were looking for was cancer. And unfortunately, her abdomen in this scan lit up like a Christmas tree. And so, although we couldn't tell where it was coming from, it seemed that whatever was going on had spread, that it was metastatic. And so I went into the room and I sat on the edge of that bed and I held her hand and I told her daughters and her what was going on and the fact that this was likely cancer that had spread, and asked them what did they want to do about it. And so her daughter translated in Mandarin to Missy all of this information. And Missy turns and looks at me and says one sentence. And so I look to her daughter for what this sentence is, and her daughter says, "Whatever you think." I was taken aback. But I had been thinking about this case nonstop for the last week and a half. And I had talked to anyone and everyone around me about it because I was just trying to figure out what to do, what the right thing to do was, because I needed to know that my affection for this family and for Miss Z wasn't blinding me, for good or for bad. And so with all of this, and after a week and a half of thinking, I told them that I actually was going to recommend pursuing hospice. And the reason being was what I had initially perceived as anxiety from this family was actually just an immense sense of love. And Missy's daughters cared so much about her that they didn't want to do anything that could cause more harm than good. They didn't want her to suffer or be in any more pain than she needed to be. And so knowing this, I told them that, trying to figure out what this is would probably require biopsies and other invasive procedures. And the bigger question is, what are we going to do about it? Would we even offer chemotherapy? The likelihood that if we did, that we would actually cause her more harm than good with the side effects was actually really large, especially in someone who had already declined in their functional status and their ability to do the things that they wanted to do. And so knowing all this, I said that I would recommend pursuing hospice at home. And so after this discussion, the decision was made to pursue hospice at home. It was my decision. And so the next day on rounds, my intern's coming and presenting her case. And when it comes to the plan, I'm in my mind, I'm like, I got this. It's going to be hospice. It's logistics at this point. Instead, she says, oh, I actually have an exciting development. And so I asked her what was going on. And so the intern had told me that they had presented her case during intern report, which is sort of a meeting of the minds of all of our first-year residents and assorted faculty members, including that day a senior oncologist who, after hearing the story and looking at the scans, said that she thought that this was lymphoma. Initially, I thought, great, we have an answer, we have a name, and that can often be really important to families and to patients to know the thing that's causing their disease and their decline. The part that changed things, though, was that the oncologist thought that the lymphoma could actually be curable and that chemotherapy could actually help her regain her functional status and her independence, her ability to go to church and to do beadwork. As this washed over me, all I could think was, I feel terrible. Missy had trusted her life with me. And I had made the decision to not pursue further workup. I had made the decision that she should go home with hospice, that this was going to be the thing that ended her life, and that it was going to happen now. So, with all this new information, we went into the room and I sat down and we told the family that there was actually new information and that there could actually be something that we could do and that this could potentially be curable. The family was immediately so gracious and thanked us for not giving up. And all I could think was, but I had. And so the next day, my last day, I went into the room and I sat down and I held Missy's hand and I told her daughters that we would be working with oncology to figure out the next steps moving forward, but that actually today was my last day and it would be another supervising doctor to help figure out what needed to be done moving forward. As Missy's daughter translated this in Mandarin to her, she started to cry. And so I leaned over and I hugged Missy. And as I was doing that, she leaned over and whispered in my ear, "I love you." My first response was, "Were you able to speak English this entire time and I missed it?" This was quickly followed by an immense sense of gratitude, but also this conflicting feeling of, did I deserve this? Did I deserve her love? I'd spent the last 2 weeks trying my best to help her and to do good by her. And in light of recent events, I had actually failed her. But that moment on her bed, as she hugged me, I realized that although I had made a mistake, maybe I wasn't necessarily a bad doctor. In fact, seemingly, in Miss Z's eyes, maybe I was a good doctor. And so, with all of that, I leaned over and whispered back, "I love you too. Thank you."
I am sitting here with Archna Eniasivam. Thank you so much for coming to talk about the story you told at our show.
I'm really excited to be here.
So your story brought such a smile to my face because I think there are so many charming elements of the story, but I also felt that it was such an important story to share to help destigmatize this concept of diagnostic errors, cognitive mishaps, and I want to get to that in a bit. But first, I'd love to hear a little bit about your path to medicine.
I feel like many people in our generation, my path to medicine started probably with an introduction to Doogie Howser, MD, who is, for those who don't remember, a child doctor, so a teenage doctor, I guess. And I think that along with several family members being in medicine, at least was an introduction to it. And when I was in middle school, I would spend several weeks during the summer with my aunt, who is a pathologist. So while most kids were, singing along to the Backstreet Boys or NSYNC, I was in a pathology lab seeing autopsies and helping to do frozen sections on kidneys for a couple weeks. I'm fairly certain that those things would not be allowed anymore, but at that time it was fine.
It's quite young. What was it like to be exposed to the dead body at such a tender age?
it made me realize that you see so much from the outside, not recognizing what's on the inside. And to be able to really look to see the heart that beats, the intestines that snake throughout the system. And I remember bookending these 2 autopsies. I saw a little baby, which was very hard as a young girl, and then this 70-year-old man. And to be able to see how one goes to the other, I think was really powerful and impactful.
I love the way that you opened your story talking about this patient who you said was on the shorter side. And so every day you would fling off the blankets expecting to find her legs, and there was nothing there because her legs were so short. I just loved that detail in the story because I've definitely had those moments where I expect to see the legs there and then it's just little feet dangling. And the affection that you had for this cute lady. And it seemed, obviously, that it was reciprocated and you just had this really beautiful rapport. So I was wondering, is that something that comes along pretty often for you? Does that happen a lot, or is that rare?
I think some combination thereof. And oftentimes my role can be associated with the most vulnerable or the saddest or the most terrifying aspect or days of one's life. But to be associated with something beautiful and to be associated with something that brings happiness is really amazing. And I'm definitely part of the reason why I do it. But in terms of, do I develop that relationship with other people? I'd like to think so. I really love what I do, and I find that we're just all storytellers, and I love listening to people's stories and seeing their relationships with their families throughout these really difficult and often troubling times.
I think that's a really great point. The association having the potential to be negative or like something you would want to forget or move on from. But then when the association becomes positive, how surprising that feels. And I think for me, I work at San Francisco General Hospital, where there's a lot of patients who, for lack of a better phrase, aren't that respectful to the staff because of, whatever trauma they've suffered in their life. There's a lot of mistrust of the medical system. There's a lot of substance use and kind of paranoia and mental illness that we don't always receive that kind of attitude from our patients. So when it does come along, for me, it really kind of knocks me over in a good way. And I find that the way that it comes out is often in the form of food. And I was reflecting back on a time that I was taking care of a patient and their family would bring in food from home. And one of the dishes that they brought in was a kind of sweet rice dish. I remember looking at it and making a comment that it looked good. And then the next day they brought me like a Tupperware of this sweet rice. And I was so caught off guard, and I thanked them. Initially I refused, and then they said, no, you have to have it. And then I took the container of rice and I sort of stepped out of the hospital room holding this container of rice. And I realized I didn't have anywhere to put it. And it was just very foreign just to have this gift in my hand. It's not often, I find, in hospital medicine that we get those kinds of gestures or tokens of appreciation. Not at all that we're expecting it or that we, need that. But when it does happen, those little tokens really can mean a lot.
I agree. And I tell a lot of my learners, if there's a nice letter or an email, I will screenshot it and to hold on to that to remind myself that, no, this is what I love to do. And at times I am good at it.
In your story, you mentioned this moment where you've already given the advice to the family that I recommend, considering that the goal right now is to not inflict more harm. And then your intern goes to the report and learns this new information that this could be potentially a curable lymphoma, and then presents it almost, it sounds like a surprise on rounds. You even say in the story you were kind of expecting the intern to just recount the plan as it was the night before, but then they kind of drop this surprise on you. And I was wondering if you could just expand a little bit more about how you felt. What was that moment like?
Well, in the moment, I can tell you that I was very glad that we weren't bedside rounding. I think I was, first and foremost, just really shocked and humbled in that moment. And then my brain quickly shifted to, okay, so now what do we do with this piece of information? And then how do we share it? And how do we share in a way that, I think this is always the thing that we grapple with and struggle with when admitting error and mistakes, is that we don't want to sacrifice our therapeutic alliance, and we don't want our patients or our team to lose faith in us and to question us and to, although, well, that's not fair, because I do think a healthy degree of questioning is always helpful. I'd like to think that by building relationships over time and investing and to continue to be honest and open allows for the path to move forward past a mistake. And so when we went in to talk to the family, we explained that we had talked to someone else and they offered us a different opinion. And the funny part, eventually, a couple of weeks later, as I was following up to see, what had gone on and what was going on, is that the family actually eventually decided not to pursue further workup and to not get a biopsy and to not pursue invasive diagnostic procedures to figure out what was going on. And I will say it probably did make me feel a little bit better, but I'm glad that they were able to come to that decision on their own without me taking away any of their options.
It's just interesting the way that we categorize these things that we call errors or near misses, or there's a bunch of different terms and phrases that we use, and whether they should be outcome dependent or not, and when is it a mistake and when is it, well, this disease just needs the test of time before it really declares itself and we can get clarity around the diagnosis. It seems like something that's really difficult to describe concretely. Do you ever feel that?
I feel that all the time, and especially because, once again, as a hospitalist, I take care of a person during this one period of time, and you have no idea where on the spectrum that person is in their disease process, right? And so there are times where I think these misses is because it's so early on before something has necessarily shown itself, whether it's in the labs or physical exam or really symptoms-wise, and unless they come back or unless someone tells you, unless you look into it yourself, you have no idea whether or not you're right or wrong. And I think that that's a really hard part in medicine. This, am I right? Am I doing the right thing? All of these questions that you're constantly trying to balance with also what does the patient and the family want? And I think that this is the eternal struggle, really.
It's true. I think sometimes the practice of medicine can feel really lonely and isolating. And for me, I actually experienced that more in residency when I was in clinic in the outpatient setting. I just felt like even though I was practicing in a clinic where there were different doctors sitting at different computers, we were all kind of doing our own thing and seeing our own patients in our little assigned room. What I loved about the hospital was that there was more of this team element, and someone will just say, hey, can I run this case by you? Or can I show you this EKG? And just this crowdsourcing of brain power that would happen.
It's so funny, as you were saying that, I just kept nodding and smiling because I really like that crowdsourcing, because I think that is where medicine is. I think that the days of encyclopedic knowledge of everything and anything that ever existed in medicine is behind us. And now it's about how do you utilize your resources? And we are each other's resources.
I completely agree with you. It's funny, you mentioned at the very beginning this model of Doogie Howser as like the whiz kid who had this encyclopedic knowledge of everything medical. And while I do think it is important to have foundational knowledge and to have kind of a library in your mind of different illness scripts and different cases that you've seen that you can kind of reach back in the archives and pull out. Once you have that foundational knowledge and the frameworks and the approach, then it's pretty easy just to look things up. And I think this is one area where tech might actually really enhance medicine. I think there's definitely scenarios where tech people think that it will help and it won't. Like, I just keep thinking about wearables and this concept of like streaming your heart rate to your doctor 24/7 and just those mountains of data. And is that even useful? It's like too much data. Like, how many blood pressure measurements do you really need? But with tech, and I think there are even some websites that are already doing this, where if you have a difficult case that you can't figure out, like, you can post it online.
Yeah.
And, get people who practice medicine in other states or even other countries around the world to weigh in on the case. And I don't know, what do you envision for the future? Do you feel like we could crowdsource diagnostic reasoning to like the hive mind of all physicians on the globe? Or is that too far?
No, those websites do exist. And I think that there is a definite place for that in the future. And I agree with you, and I hope that that allows for more space and time to actually be able to spend with our patients and to connect with them and getting to know their backgrounds and all of the things that factor into their health and in their life that we haven't necessarily been able to focus on in the past. I think that, what we've been circling around is, what does it mean to be a doctor in the 21st century? And what does it mean to be a good doctor? And I think that we as a profession need to evolve to see where we're at.
And that was the point of your story, was that even though there was this gap in the diagnosis, what your patient saw and what your patient cared about was the love and tender kindness that you were dishing out at the bedside, and those smiles, and there's those moments sharing the mangoes. And I think recognizing the inherent therapeutic value in that is worthwhile. And I think your story really illuminated that, because at the end you said, this whole time I was wondering if maybe I was a bad doctor. And I realized that maybe I wasn't a bad doctor. And in fact, maybe I was a good doctor. I mean, how much did that event really affect you?
I think that initially, after that, I did doubt myself for a while. And I think that what was helpful for me was the fact that, as I had mentioned, she inevitably made the same decision. And so I think that allowed me to have some closure a little sooner rather than later. But I have had instances where there has been something that I could have done better that has resulted, in an adverse outcome, and I have sat with that for months.
Yeah, and I think just having a culture of acceptance and openness and support for physicians who do go through medical errors is paramount. Because I remember when I was a resident on an overnight shift once, there was a woman who put some orders into the computer, and then 45 minutes later, she was sitting at the computer and she gasped, and she turned around and she was like, oh my God, I put in 45 minutes ago these orders on the wrong patient. And it was 4 antibiotics. It was actually RIPE therapy, each letter of RIPE standing for a different medicine for tuberculosis. And she had put in those 4 medicines, and they had actually been given to the wrong patient. And she was like, oh gosh, I feel horrible. And she was like, what do I do? And people kind of swept in, and they were like, oh, this is what you should do. You can submit an incident report. And people are doing that all the time now. I see submitting incident reports on themselves, just with that knowledge that they're not going to get into trouble, that really the purpose of submitting the incident report is to create data so that we know where the errors are happening, whether it's just clicking the wrong button, or, maybe we should be able to have 2 charts open at once so that we're not confused about whose chart we're in and putting orders in the right patient, so that we can make changes and improve the quality of the care and the safety of the care that we give. But if you're steeped in a culture of fear and you're not able to admit that you made the mistake, or say it out loud, or stop in the middle of a crowded room and just share, then I think we'll never know. And so seeing that incident report process existing in our hospitals, but even more being used in our hospital, and I think it's probably underused, is one way to help physicians through these difficult moments where things don't go as planned.
I definitely agree.
Well, thanks again for coming to talk about your story. I thought it was really courageous to share that. And it meant a lot to me personally to have you come and share that story. And I hope that The more people who come forward to share stories about times things didn't go quite right, then the more we can learn about how to deal with this and how to, make things better and also take care of the doctors and not just the patients. So important to keep in mind.
Thank you for creating a space and a ability to be able to share in these stories and to show the human side of what we do.